Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the presentation, Section 201 Trade Case, brought to you by AEE Solar and Chris Macy with REC. Before we begin, if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please notify me by typing your question in the question pane of your control panel on the right-hand side of the screen and click send. At the end, we will be having a question and answer session following the presentation. You're more than welcome to submit your questions at any point during the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible after the presentation. Also, there will be a brief survey that pops up in a new window immediately following the webinar. Please take a couple of minutes to complete it, and we will email you a copy of the presentation. There's no questions. I'd like to go ahead and introduce our presenter today, Chris Macy, Key Account Manager with REC. I'm going to go ahead and pass the presentation over to you, Chris.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. Much appreciated, and good morning to everyone who's not on the East Coast, and good almost afternoon to those who are. I would like to first of all make a statement that the intent behind this presentation, it is not a duplication of the subject material from AE's webinar of 2 weeks ago. If those of you caught that, it was a fantastic presentation with presenters from the Sunrun and AEE policy team, with team members from the supply chain management function within the company, myself as well. This is not the exact same material. What this is a response to various conversations I've had in the last month with folks across this country who are very curious and still have unanswered questions into what exactly happened in the last 9 months. Where did we start? What were the milestones and steps along this process? Are we sitting now where we thought we would be collectively as an industry? What sort of variables are still outstanding? And what does the next 1, 2, 4 years look like? So I'll do my best to address this in detail. This is not a particular plug for REC product. This is more along the lines of looking to develop a baseline in our industry of a factual basis of what we're all working with here and what to do with that. So Caitlin, if you could move us to the next slide, that would be fantastic. I think we can probably cover this material in 15 minutes or so. We're not going to take an entire hour. I promise to be efficient with your time. So we'll work relatively quickly through the 4 main content slides that I have, and then open up for Q&A for those of you that have time and interest to do so, and we can cover any sort of range of topic that's interesting to you. But basically what we will be working with sequentially in these content slides is, number 1, with the Section 201 complaint that started back in April of 2017, what were the milestones in the organizations involved in this process? What did we learn along the way? And sort of how was that ball transferred along the way to ultimately what became a presidential decision? That decision in that number 2 bullet point here came about on January 22nd. So dissecting that a bit, what exactly did it mean? What sort of verbiage was contained? What sort of directives will be handed down to the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol? That would be important to know at the moment. And then number 3, with respect to things that are still outstanding, there's this talk of imported cell exemption of a certain amount, the potential for technology or product exemptions. How is that working? On what sort of timeline? What is the likely outcome? We'll talk a bit about that. And then once we have a solid baseline of where we sit today and what sort of timeline to fully box in what this looks like, what do we know and what do we think will happen in this prescribed 4-year time period of the tariffs? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. The next slide, Caitlin, will show us, again, the 2017 milestones and process. And I think a majority of us were following either through watching the government organizations or the press coverage of this. The content here from the REC side was developed by our own market intelligence group. We also had engaged through this process with our own folks in Washington and an outside counsel, a international trade firm, and then also a lobbying firm that was fairly well connected into the Trump administration and into the U.S. Trade Representative, which is Robert Lighthizer office. So that's basically the spread and the reach that REC had through this process as a direct participant. So this was all kicked off at the end of April as a petition by Suniva. So I think we've collectively as an industry already acknowledged the irony that while yes, Suniva was an American manufacturer representing legitimate American jobs, it was also a majority Chinese owned company. However, it's important to understand from the beginning that the nature of this Section 201, which is a fairly obscure provision in a trade act that goes all the way back to 1978, rarely used. The last time was circa 2001 in a steel case. But this is known as a quote-unquote global safeguard investigation. The important element there is that it has nothing to do with business or commercial actions that were perceived to be right or wrong. This is very different than the previous anti-dumping and countervailing duties, which is specifically the practices of selling below cost and then having countervailable subsidies, basically subsidies within a country that your competitors from another country do not have access to, thereby generating an unfair advantage. That was the basis of the prior 2012 and 2014 anti-dumping and countervailing duties cases. It had nothing to do with the Section 201 complaint. This was purely around the notion that imports in an increasing quantity are a substantial cause of either serious injury that's already been realized or threat of a serious injury to a U.S. industry. So that was the basis of how everything kicked off about 9 months ago. There was a relatively lengthy period of investigation and testimonial happening with a great deal of U.S. industry participation, both from what we call the upstream, which would be manufacturers, and then also the downstream, which are folks that are installing products. This really consummated in a September 22nd vote, which is where the U.S. International Trade Commission would decide whether indeed there was serious injury or not from these imports. There, in this time period, was 4 commissioners. It was a unanimous decision, 4-0, that there had been serious injury to the U.S. industry from imports of crystalline silicon PV. Within there was a bit of a subtext of potentially a different treatment for different countries of origin, specifically the countries that have a free trade agreement with the U.S. federal government. Relevant to our industry, that would be Singapore, Canada, Korea. Really, that's about it. So I've, in the bullet points here, I'm referring to the outliers here, which are the ones that would not be a part of serious injury. There was a unanimous vote of no injury from Singapore imports, which is really, in terms of any meaningful production, it's just REC. There's a few manufacturers in Canada. There was a non-unanimous, but call it a split decision vote, kind of like the boxing world, 3-1 was no injury for Canada. So folks that were watching this process thought that there would be almost assuredly a separate and better treatment, maybe a full exemption or exclusion for imports that were manufactured in Singapore or Canada. It took the US ITC another almost 1 month to come up with their comprehensive report that was made available. You can actually search this online. It's a great cure for insomnia because it's literally over 400 pages long. But basically within there, the guts is that the US ITC makes a recommendation to the president's office. There were a total of 3 different recommendations. There could have actually been a total of 4. Every single commissioner could have made a different recommendation. What happened is that there were basically 2 very similar recommendations, with 2 of the commissioners vouching for one of them. There was only one very different recommendation that I have labeled here as a dissenting recommendation that was almost the mirror of the proposal by the Solar Energy Industry Association, our trade association, which was dealing with an import license fee of a very nominal amount. Minimum 1 cent a watt, even if it was just a few cents a watt, clearly a much different construction than a 30 or a 35% tariff. From that ITC report, there was an interactivity between the U.S. Trade Representative, which is basically the part of the presidential administration that deals with trade matters. The most influential person in the U.S. Trade Representative office is the U.S. Trade Representative himself, who is Robert Lighthizer. So the degree to which our president actually is involved in the weeds and the details, probably not much. He's got a lot of other things going on. So Robert Lighthizer and his team within the U.S. Trade Representatives are an important part of this process in terms of coming up with a decision. In their review process, which took over 1 month, they also made an additional information request back to the US ITC. We'll cover that in a bit more detail, but what's notable about that is that it seemed to be in preparation for expecting challenges through the World Trade Organization, WTO. This does become an important part of the complexion of where this is likely to go. So again, this is something that is, for all intents and purposes, likely not a surprise to the U.S. Trade Representative to have to deal with these complaints filed through the WTO. At the other end of the decision process, the final output, and this took almost 9 months to get completed, from the original petition of April 26, and the final decision. There's really 2 dates here that are adjacent: January 22nd, January 23rd. We all heard the initial announcement on January 22nd. That was from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and I think at that time there was a budget-related funding shutdown of the federal government that did impact the USTR, which was on sort of a skeleton crew. So we had a news release to the public that in tandem dealt with washing machines and then solar products. But there was a lot of questions that were left unanswered. A more full addressing of that came the next day on the 23rd in this quote-unquote presidential proclamation. But it was very clear from the information that was given to us on January 22nd, then January 23rd, that there would be no country-specific exclusion. So not Singapore, not Canada, not Korea, but it was Canada and Singapore that were the bigger surprises. There is this notion of these GSP beneficiary developing countries, we'll talk about in a future slide, that looks to be the only really exemption loophole for a country of origin that exists. It does have some caveats and some strings attached. But the final important element to go back here on this entire time frame is that the scoping here is crystalline silicon PV cells, whether or not made into modules. So automatically excluded from that definition is thin film, although in 2018, that's not really a part of our world unless you're a utility developer, where First Solar with their CAD-TEL product is very present. Other thin film players are much smaller. So whether it's the Japanese company Solar Frontier, which sort of came and went, a majority of the industry by far today is crystalline silicon. So this is very impactful for almost all of the products that the US industry would consider to work with. Caitlin, if we could move to the next slide, we'll dive in a little bit deeper into an element here that is important, which is in this January 22nd decision that was further elaborated upon in the 23rd presidential proclamation. What exactly was said here? How did these words, how were they crystallized, and then what does that mean? Because these are bureaucrats, politicians, sort of generalist trade experts in the sense that they are not PV technologists. So the wording and the interpretation matters a lot in terms of what loopholes or opportunities are created. So this safeguard measure, which is the tariff, applies to quote unquote solar cells, whether or not assembled into modules. So again, it's about the cell, whether it's already in a module or not. And then the other pieces are, I'd say, not terribly meaningful. Parts or subassemblies of solar cells, meaning there's not a way to game the system by having a piece that would be further transformed later. Inverters or batteries with crystalline silicon PV cells attached, DC generators with cells attached. We'll see in another slide some of the specific exclusions that are already granted and what it takes to get additional exclusions. But really, the spirit here is that there are, in my view, and in REC's view, no open loopholes here other than that second bullet point, which is a country-specific potential for GSP beneficiary nations, which are basically these developing countries, to the degree that of the total amount of crystalline silicon PV imports, not more than 3% of that value could come from one of those countries, And if you take the imports from all of those countries, it could not be more than 9% of the total. Otherwise, duties and tariffs would apply. There would be an exclusion. This is you can do an internet search if you want to see the long list of countries that are GSP beneficiary, but with respect to PV manufacturing, there's relatively few. I would say the number one by volume by far is India, although it's debatable how much bankable product and commercially reliable organizations there are to work with in the US that have Indian product. They also have their own relatively strong domestic market that also has some trade restrictions in play that would potentially make them want to only serve their domestic market, not necessarily the US. And then quite far behind India, we've also got Turkey and Brazil. Brazil, those manufacturing facilities were really set up to service a domestic content requirement that's quite rigorous in their own country. Turkey, those facilities were set up under the old European minimum import price scheme. Debatable the quality of those facilities and those players, or if they're even being used today. So again, there's no easy answer here, but this is an important element to understand about how are the ground rules being set forth. The timing of this tariff, it is already in play. February 7th was 2 weeks ago, so this is something, this isn't a future likelihood, this is happening right now. The most interesting aspect of that 22nd decision and 23rd proclamation was that the proclamation of the 23rd required the U.S. Trade Representative to come up with a process for an exclusion request, and I have underlined here, of a particular product. It's very meaningful what they are considering to be legitimate grounds for an exclusion versus not legitimate, because it is different than the elements that have been addressed through this process of 2017. Caitlin, if we move to the next slide, we'll see a bit more about what this means. I think this is where it really gets fascinating. The first piece is a bit more clear in terms of scoping, which is from that original 22nd decision and the paperwork that came out of the U.S. Trade Representative. What I have in quotes here was verbatim what it said. The first 2.5 gigawatts of imported cells are excluded from the additional tariff. What they mean by additional tariff is Section 201 tariff. It is additional to the old AD/CVD cases of 2014-2012. Those still stay in effect. They are revisited on an annual basis anyway with new data inputs. But basically those scopings are still active. So this is in addition to that. But ostensibly this 2.5 gigawatts of imported cell exemption is to enable the competitiveness of domestic manufacturing of modules that does not have a domestic manufacturing of cells next to it. So basically buying cells at a global price, bringing them into the US, converting them into modules in the US, and these things would probably be sold at a market price anyway. So it's not likely that any sort of an exemption here results in a lower module price from US produced modules with international cells. In our direct interactions with the US Trade Representative, they're not even clear right now on how that's going to be managed. And keep in mind, it's the US Trade Representative that needs to give specific instructions to the US Customs and Border Patrol on how to manage things according to a harmonized tariff schedule. And at this point, that doesn't even exist. And furthermore, it appears that they're not worried about it, that would be a soft amount, which is basically whatever amount domestic module producers want to bring in, they're not worried about levying tariffs on it. So maybe it's 1 gigawatt, maybe it's 3, maybe it's 5. I think the practicality of those higher numbers is not likely. But it doesn't seem like that's something at this point that is going to be very, very closely managed. But also for the folks on this call, it's not likely to be very impactful to the price of a module that is purchased in the US. So that's the cell exemption. The next part gets to be quite a bit more nuanced, which is this notion of a technology or a product exemption. So again, this is where the presidential proclamation directed the USTR to develop this process. It didn't already exist, but the verbiage that's continuously used is particular products. So I'll jump down a couple lines to right away, what is not a valid reason? What can you not even make a case around a different treatment for? A specific customer, a specific name of a producer, a specific country of origin, the fact you have a trademark around something, none of those are considered valid reasons. You also have to be able to clearly define this and be willing to make it public. So it can't be something that's sort of behind the curtain and not disclosed. So as the public, we are going to see this happen. We'll talk a bit about how we can all keep pace of that in a second here. But specifically, when we talk about free trade agreement countries and all these other things that were an element of consideration 2017, that is not a part of this. So for example, if you were theoretically, a US company that was majority acquired by an international oil company and had a fairly unique product that you make the majority of it in the Philippines, you could not use the nature of your company or that Philippine production or any sort of trademarks or brand names you have that are different about that as the basis for an exclusion request. What you could use are physical characteristics of your product that are differentiated from the products that are subject to the safeguard measures. So basically take that to be the entire CSPV population as a whole. If you can prove that your product is notably different, maybe you have a shot at an exclusion based off of that. This is all playing through in live time right now. The deadline that they've established, the US Trade Representative, for an exclusion request is March 16th. So still another 3 weeks of additional requests for exclusion coming in. And believe me, there are a lot of them. There's a ton of requests. It's going to take the USTR quite a lot of time to go through this, unless they're applying a sort of a very obtuse measure and just kicking out a lot of these right from the get-go. They're going to have a lot of work to do. The stakeholder group that's reviewing this ranges from as non-technical to just broad-based trade policy people to very highly technically informed engineers with a grounding in PV science from the Department of Energy. So it's a pretty wide spectrum of folks. And again, this is from direct REC experience. We have our team in Washington also pushing through this based off of some interesting differences that REC has in our vertically integrated production process. But there's no guarantees for anyone into how this goes. All of these requests for exclusion have to be in by March 16th, and then there is another month of public commentary. So this could be the general public, it could be political participants at a non-federal level, it could be really just anyone in the general public. And I have a hyperlink in this presentation, regulations.gov, and if you just search using their search feature, the docket number for this case, which is USTR 2018-0001, already you will see the nature of this case posted. You won't see any of the commentary yet because the request deadline has not even elapsed. However, I think this will be in live time. There's some debate right now as to whether we will see all of the public commentary posted after April 16th, or if we will see it in live time between March 16th and April 16th. But either way, this is not an opaque process. It's something that any of us can go and watch on a day-to-day basis. The decision makers, as I said in the stakeholder group, US Trade Representative, the Department of Commerce, Department of Energy, and it will be extremely interesting to see what do they exclude. Just as my final bullet point at the bottom, to get an idea of how nuanced and how specific this can be, there has already been some exclusions right from the get-go. And this is really what I completely non-technically refer to small stuff. So 10 to 60 watt rectangular panels, 1 watt panels in nightlights, 2 watt panels in dimmers. My favorite is actually the one at the end there, which is very, very detailed. That's less than or equal to 27.1 watt solar panels with a polyurethane doming resin, which is joined to a battery charging unit and also incorporating an LED. So we're going to potentially get some really interesting stuff coming out of this. How impactful is it to the class of product that all of us are installing as an industry in residential and commercial? TBD. We don't know, but it is one of these lingering question marks that is TBD. Caitlin, on the next slide, we'll look at what I consider to be the major factors in what we should all watch in further defining what is the market environment that we are working within. The first piece is what I just talked about. That's the results of these product exemption requests. They've stipulated this current time period, which is basically in the next 3 weeks for the request, and another 1 month of public commentary. It probably takes them until May to even make a decision. And then there's the potential ability for monitoring developments in the market where they could go back and grant exclusions at any time, or really adjust with a fair amount of latitude whatever they want. There is this already stipulated regression, meaning a decline in the tariff rates from year to year over this 4-year period. So 30%, 25%, 20%, 15%. So already it's becoming less impactful on a year-by-year basis. But sitting within this time period, we have the question mark of how effective is a WTO challenge. These challenges are already being filed from entities related to the trade ministry of different countries, to individual companies. But the WTO cannot directly impact US policy or law. What they do is actually fairly interesting. It probably takes a 1.5 years minimum to maybe 2 years to even go through their process to have anything actionable. But what is potentially actionable coming out the other side is really what's known as a sanctioned retaliation. Basically, other countries could threaten the US to put tariffs and trade restrictions on US exports. So whether it's Florida oranges or US manufactured steel or Boeing airliners or whatever it may be, they basically can legitimize a retaliation, and that creates political pressure where other countries around the world could say, hey, US, President Trump, we will do this unless you treat us more fairly. The way this worked out back in 2001 with the steel case, it coincided, I think about 18 months into the Section 201 steel case with a re-election cycle for President Bush. So it was very politically meaningful and caused for the Bush administration to repeal the tariffs on imported steel. Will that happen for us if you basically say 2 years from now, we'll have a president who's 3 years into his first term? Maybe he's starting to think about campaigning for re-election, or maybe not, or maybe he's impeached. The White House is a big wild card these days. But does that land in a time period where it's politically impactful and causes him to choose to do something? Who knows? But that is basically the construct around the WTO challenges. There is also this notion of potentially a greater trade negotiation, a renegotiation with other trading partners, and China has been #1 on this list just due to the severe trade imbalance of the amount of imports they bring to the US versus what we take to their country. So is this part of a greater presidential motivation to negotiate with the country of China on all aspects of trade? And PV is just one little part of it. That's a possibility as well. It doesn't seem to be moving along very quickly in that direction, but these are things that are relevant whether you are a very big installer of solar products, a very small installer, because it completely determines the landscape in the industry and how it is different in 2018 than it was beginning of last year or any previous year. So I'm going to stop just short of making firm recommendations for what we should all do. My personal guesstimate is that it seems like pricing for crystalline modules in the first half of the year is relatively stable. And AEE and Sunrun actually did a very smart thing and stockpiled a lot of materials and made some very good business negotiation decisions and contracts to make sure to have a reliable supply at a predictable price point for their customers. I think we probably see some variability coming in the second half of the year. So if we see a healthy balance between supply and demand in the industry and a healthy Chinese domestic market, then basically the second half of the year, I think you may see manufacturers looking at things like transfer price, which is what has to be reported to the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, and that's what the tariff is based on, and then look at market pricing and margins. I think when that entire cost stack is reevaluated in the second half of the year, if supply-demand balance is healthy, I think you may see a slight uptick in pricing. I don't think it'll be a big one, but it could be a little bit higher than what you see today. And then, of course, subsequent years, maybe an incremental decrease. But basically, I see stability in the near term, midterm, maybe a slight uptick, and then sort of a slight decline in lockstep with the reduction in the tariff going out from there. So that really is the basis of this presentation, the material that I wanted to communicate. I'd love to go ahead and open it up for questions for any of you that have the interest. If you're running out of time, completely understand. The slide deck will be available through the typical AE channel. And Caitlin, if we can go ahead and work with any questions we've got, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for putting that together for us. If you do have any questions, go ahead and submit those to the questions pane located on your control panel, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. You can also exit the webinar at any time during or following the question and answer session. The survey will pop up in a new window once the webinar is ended. Give us your feedback on the survey, and I will send you the presentation. So the first question that we have here